Almost there.
Almost.
So I've got a guest here today that really doesn't need an introduction because he's been a frequent visitor to the Woodland Escape, Mr. Bob Miller, and a good friend, avid historian. Both Bob and I do a lot of experimental archaeology, some call it. We do a lot of research. We love to share that research, but we've both over the years struggled to...
A lot of finding out what does not work. So I know a lot more about how they didn't do things than how they did.
They actually did.
Yeah.
But today a treat for us because we love to share our things that we've mastered, I guess, or somewhat mastered. We love to share those skills with people, but more than that, we love to learn new ones. And today we have got a treat because we've got a guest. He's up at the fort right now, supposedly cooking supper. And I think I can smell it cooking. Anyway, let's go up there. I think you're going to enjoy this episode because the guy is, well, I'll leave that till we get up to the fort.
Awesome.
There he is, fine-tuning the instruments and doing some calculations. Jason,
Hi,
a pleasure. I'd like to introduce Bob Miller, Jason Swain.
Great to meet you.
Jason has made the trek from the colonies all the way up from the fine state of Kentucky. And welcome, Jason. A bit further trek than you made today, Bob.
It is.
It is indeed. It is indeed. So Jason is going to teach Bob and I today, which is something we're really looking forward to. And it's always fascinated me when we think about the North American continent and we're into the 16 and then into the 1700s. How did they go into this? We call it wilderness, the natives called it home, but wilderness to us, and delineate lines where Bob would own a certain tract of land, and Peter would own a certain tract of land, and you're going to walk us through it all today.
Glad to do it. You got to remember that every single piece of mile from Newfoundland to the Pacific Ocean had to be surveyed. From Canada all the way down to Florida and even into Mexico. So every piece of property we own today had to be surveyed by somebody, and they did it all by hand. And they did it with small crews and large crews. And even today, they still are doing surveying.
And we're going to actually go through the steps. You're going to employ Bob and I today. I think you said our first job is going to be axeman.
Axeman, yes. You had to clear a clear path, when you're doing a line. And we use this instrument to keep the line straight. And then we use a thing called a chain to keep the line straight. And it also was a measuring tool.
Right. We're going to get into the intricacies of the math as we progress, but so, and they were called cut lines at that time. I know we call them that today.
No, they were just the survey lines. All they were really doing is clearing the brush and the smaller trees. They left the bigger trees as markers of some kind, and they would cut usually about 7 foot up. They would cut a section of the bark off, and put a number or put an initial, and those are called blazes. And sometimes they were going along and they would see somebody had already surveyed and blazed the trail.
I got this mental image of Daniel Boone walking through the Cumberland Gap and going, this looks like a good place to call home, and making that blaze, carving his initials into it.
Yeah,
And,
but you couldn't just do it because you wanted to. You actually had to have a grant, a land grant or a warrant to go and claim that land.
And we're going to get into that. So, and some of the complexities of your surveying lots that have been allocated for military purposes for their service in a war, let's say French and Indian or Rev War. You're partway through a lot, you come across one of these blazes, you're going to get into that as well.
A lot of legal fights.
Yeah. So the first thing is Bob and we're going to actually go into the bush, find a spot that isn't cleared. How are you with an axe, Bob? I think
We'll find out.
Pretty handy. And you tell me, you were mentioning that it's actually the most dangerous job for a few reasons.
Yeah, one of the reasons was the creatures. You didn't know what was under the brush. It could have been a snake or spiders, or even you run into a bear or a mountain lion. Or in the 1700s, you still had woodland bison who could be back in the woods in a herd, and you startle them, and you might get trampled to death.
Mm-hmm.
But you also had the real danger was the native tribes who did not want you there. Surveyors were one of the most hated groups of people, and they were almost sight on scene kill kind of thing, because they called this instrument here in various native languages, they called it the land stealer, because it was thought that after the surveyors came, the settlers came.
They followed.
And that pushed the natives farther inland, outland, wherever, and that actually is true.
And the Axeman, Bob and I, we're going to be out front of the main party that's doing the math and the surveying. So we would, in a lot of cases, be toting this as well as an axe.
You would have your rifles or muskets close on hand, and so would everybody back on the main chain gang. And you'd also have a hunter or a scout. Sometimes they fulfilled both roles out on the flanks, just making sure there's no one watching you doing your work.
Okay. Maybe before we actually get out there in the bugs, and we have a few of them about today, and experience this firsthand, why don't we have a sit down and we can talk about some of the other subtleties of your trade, sir?
Sounds good. I put a roast on earlier.
We could smell it coming in, right, Bob? Bob was the first to notice it. He says, I think I smell rubber. Very good. Let's have a sit down.
All right.
What do you think?
I'm just wondering if that's ready yet.
It's not quite ready. It needs a few more minutes.
Really? I'm a bit,
All right.
peckish here.
Not long now.
You know, while we're waiting, I got to show a few items. And a big thank you to Terry Crawford down in your parts there. Jason, he's from the fine colony of Maryland, and an extraordinary leather maker. He sent me a couple of gifts. So he sent me one here that he's made from bark tan. I believe it's elk hide as well. This is brain tanned elk hide. His good friend Gail Mama, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, hand wove the, or perhaps loomed it, but a beautiful, beautiful sash for it. And he also found an original horn, which, what do you think, Bob? That's a dandy.
I love it.
And her husband Sparks, he's a horn maker. He found a couple of leaks in it, so he replaced one of the hawthorn pins in the plate and made a new plug, and she's airtight now. It's like wearing a bit of history.
I wish it could talk.
Really, it would tell some stories for sure. Anyway, a big thank you. He also sent along another friend of his by the name of Keith Castile, sent me a slate turkey call, which I've been trying to work at here. What?
It's like a dying turkey.
You know, I had it working the other day, so I'll have some practice required before next spring, do you think? Yeah. Anyway, a huge thank you for those marvelous gifts. It's pretty amazing. And also, Jason, amazing that you would make the trek all the way up here to educate Bob and I. And yeah. Is the roast done yet?
Not yet. We still have some time.
What the heck? Maybe before we get actually using these instruments, Jason, maybe you can explain the instruments, what they're called, how they function, and that'll make a little more sense to your wannabe apprentices here for the day. I know Bob's got a lot of questions he's going to ask you.
Yeah. Firstly, I'm interested in by what authority you're doing this in the first place, and because whether or not the results are going to be accepted would be based on.
Yes, all surveyors had to be licensed. You had to take a course of study, and then you had to take a test to have your license. It's the same today. And most of your surveying companies were commissioned by the Crown or later on the states to survey lands in the backcountry.
You mentioned Jason, that so there's a fee, obviously, for your services. We're going to get into crews and crew size and make up a crew, but so you're there, you're surveying, you're applying a fee. Let's say Mr. Miller here was fought in the militia in the F&I wars, and he's given 100 acres, and he's in an area you're going to be surveying. First of all, you advertise that you're going to be there.
Yes.
And so Bob knows, well, this is my opportunity if I want to get a deed for this 100-acre lot. But there's a fee, and sometimes that fee didn't actually get paid. What transpired then?
Well, there's a couple of things. Sometimes you would get the warrant or the land grant, and you didn't want the land, or you didn't really want to move back into the wilderness, and so you could sell that. Usually pennies on the pound. No one really knew what land was worth. They did in the towns, but not in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. So you would maybe for 100 acres, you might get 10 pounds, 15 pounds, ready money in your pocket, instead of trying to make a homestead out in the wilderness.
I'm thinking your trade was a very affluent one, sir.
Well, you know, it's better to have the 15 pounds in your pocket than to have a useless piece of property you're never going to use.
So surveyors became very wealthy individuals.
Surveyors became very wealthy. They became very large landowners. Some of these tracts are 20,000, 50,000 acres, which is almost town size, but they were planning on making them farms.
Incredible.
And they also, you know, regimental commanders bought land from their soldiers. Washington did this and acquired around 25, 30,000 acres in what we now call West Virginia.
After the F&I War.
After the F&I War, yeah.
Wow.
So I read all the time about multiple disputes. So when you're filing the results of your survey, where does that go, and what's the legitimacy of whoever you're filing it with?
You first went back to the Capitol and you talked to the Surveyor General, and he would approve your surveys. Sometimes they didn't. There was some bribery involved in some cases, and in some cases it was just pure petulance. He didn't like you that day. But after he approved, and let's say he approved the whole ledger book of surveys, you would walk down to the courthouse where you would see the judge, and then he would record your surveys in a survey book, which we can still look at today.
And at that point, a deed was issued.
And a deed was issued and given to the
deed.
Yeah. And usually after that, an advertisement was done in the local newspaper saying that the company had returned, and come get your deeds.
And if they weren't claimed?
Well, you had names and you had addresses, but after a while they would be unclaimed property. They would revert back to the state.
And be sold.
Off. And sometimes that would happen. Someone may have passed away or forgot that they haven't had a claim. And so most of the time they were sold off, usually by one of the larger landowners who already had 15,000. He could add another couple thousand to his lots.
Perfect. Shall we have a look at the instruments?
Sure.
Okay, I'm assuming we're looking at one of the primary instruments here.
The primary instrument, which was a circumferentor, or the surveyor's compass, easier to say. These were handmade, usually out of brass. The early ones are made out of wood. The early ones also had a different opening on them, but this is a little bit later design where they learned how to mill straight lines in brass.
They used a horsehair, strung horsehair for their center line.
Correct.
So the predecessor to this was called?
An Astrolabe.
And I have a wee bit of a story about the Astrolabe. They believe it was Champlain's, Samuel de Champlain's. As the story goes, late 1800s, there's a father and son logging, and they're using a team of oxen, and they scrape some moss off a rock, and there sits this instrument that they were kind of baffled with. They stop for lunch, having lunch. Some guy comes along and says, "I'll give you $10 for it," which in today's money is astronomical, 170, 200 bucks. Kid says, okay. Kid never gets the money. Eventually that instrument ended up in a museum in your country, sir. And I'm not sure the year, I think it was the early 90s, that it was purchased back. It now resides at the
Museum of Civilization
in Hull, Quebec, correct, Bob? And we had to pay you folks something like $250 for it, 250,000 US dollars for it. But it's found its home. It's back in Quebec, where it should be, in its rightful home. And anyway, I digress. So now we're on to this modern instrument, and you're going to tell us how it works.
Yeah, so it's basically a compass. It points north and it has degrees in it. And when you're following a line, as we were talking about lines earlier, the surveyor looked through this end and looked through this end, and it creates a very fine line. And you would have a chain, an iron chain. It's about 66 foot long. And two men called chainmen would pull it really tight. And you actually, through these little tiny slits, you can see that chain very clearly. And they would pull it left to right, and then they would mark it with a pin. Now later on, pins were made of iron and they had little red flags on them, but the early days, all they used was a stick. And they would carry, and it was just a marking device for a temporary marker. It didn't need to be permanent.
And then you're recording that in your ledgers.
And then we would have, usually there was a recorder with you, and he would be writing down how many chain lengths you had gone, left, right, how many degrees you were at, looking at the compass as well. Sometimes the surveyor did it himself.
You mentioned, Jason, the one item, you brought all these interesting tools, but the one item you left at home was your actual chain.
My actual chain I lost in the river on the crossings. Yeah.
So we're going to use a rope today, but that was used, actually. Yep. It was a tool that was used.
It was.
The other evening, and we're going to put a chart in, we were talking about the oddities, some of the oddities of surveying, and one of them was that a chain link is 7.92 inches long. And a full chain spread out was 16 feet.
66.
66 feet, sorry, which is still used to this day. We still use it for road allowances and right-of-ways. But that seems like an odd number. It's going to start to make a whole lot of sense, right? It all comes together.
It all comes together in the acre and in the mile.
So that 7.92 was crucial for
was crucial,
chain.
And we also had a rod that was 6 chains high, so it was a little over 6 foot tall, and that was used to measure heights and elevations. And there was another tool that was used. It's the ancestor to the modern transit. It was called a theodolite, and it was the same kind of thing. It also had a compass on it, and it was used for elevations, and mainly used in town.
So Bob and I were a little primitive. I see Bob studying this instrument with some perplexity, sir.
This would be the more modern, the 18th century version of the Astrolabe.
Astrolabe, yeah, very much. It's called a Hadley's quadrant, and it is the direct ancestor of the modern sextant, which they still use on board ships. And it's used to measure elevations as well. But in surveying, we don't use it this way, which was held up. We use it sideways. And it's used to measure distances across things like rivers or ponds or lakes. And there was a process to do it, but if you knew a little bit of geometry, a little bit of triangular geometry, you could figure it out pretty easily. And that's how it was used the first time in that capacity at the Mason-Dixon survey of the Mason-Dixon line. They had to cross several rivers, and they discovered this was the easiest way to guess how far that river was across.
We think about the complexities, like a lot of surveys, we think they're rectangles or squares, but enter in a mountain range or a ridge, a meandering creek or stream, which often became the line. So the complexities got a little more interesting or sophisticated when you had to survey something that, we're talking pre-calculus days, so you're trying to figure out acreage with this meandering line as a property line.
Yeah, the textbook of the age was Samuel Wild's 1722 Practical Surveyor, and it told you and showed you how to do those strange curves, and it basically broke it up into as many lines as you could make it work. And you're right, none of them were square, really. They were all kind of different angles to get that 100 acres or 200 acres or 15,000 acres. Some of them were all kind of different angles and
So you would have, let's say, a river where, let's say the property line was the middle of that river or stream, and then you would survey lines at right angles to that line.
Correct.
And then you would measure the distance of that right angle line.
Correct.
At different points, and that's
Yes.
how you would determine the acreage of Bob Miller's lot.
If the creek was 66 foot across, you could use the chain to figure it out. But if it was not, then you use this.
Go to that instrument.
And then it gave you, like, let's just say it's 300 feet across. And then you would say, okay, you own 150 and you own 150. And then you'd have to plot the middle of the creek or the river and have to figure it out from there to make up the property allowance.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Fascinating.
And you've heard of the old meets and bounds. Meets are the straight lines, and the bounds are boundaries, or a tree, or a stream, or a rock facing, or something like that.
There are a lot of interesting phrases. Blue blazes comes to mind,
Yeah.
right?
So
You might elaborate on that.
blue blazes are when we would blaze the trees. Sometimes they were colored, and blue is a favored color. Mm-hmm. And easy to mix and easy to create. And so they would create the blazes up in the trees, and they would slap blue paint on them. They still do that today.
And now we use that terminology. What in the blue blazes?
And that's often surveyors would come across one, and that would mean that property had been surveyed already. And so they were astonished that somebody had already beat them to it.
Yeah.
And they had to start over again.
Very good.
I know in our township, which was surveyed, it's Loyalist, and some of the lots are so irregular because everyone wanted a certain amount of road frontage.
Yeah,
So
and
I
that,
find
in
that
towns,
really
it was a little bit more difficult. And the funny thing is that we're still surveying today. Even towns today are still being surveyed for lots, or for if they want to break up a piece of property. Surveying is still a lucrative career.
Mm-hmm. Done quite a bit differently than you did it.
Done with a little bit more electronic devices, but they have done old surveys with these instruments, and they're almost within inches of each other. Sometimes they're spot on.
Of being accurate to modern techniques.
Correct.
We're going to learn that this afternoon. I think it's time to eat. Whereabouts, sir?
All right, we're going to clear a path right back through there, as straight as you can get, pass through the line right there.
All right. Don't know why it is I own the land and I get the lowest paying, most dangerous job.
Well, you're going to do more after this.
Okay.
Watch out for snakes.
That good, Jason?
Yeah, that looks fine.
As close to the stand as
Yeah,
possible?
try to get right up against it, and with your hand. Okay, and now what you're going to want to do is pull it as tight as you can along there. Okay, you're going to go to your right. One more step. Right there. Now you would mark it right there with a pin. Yep. So you take a pin and just mark it right there.
Right at my toe. Oh, here we go.
Stick it in?
Yep.
Good.
I got her.
All right, axemen forward.
That was fascinating, Jason. You gave us a small taste of what it would have been like. We're in rather a mosquito-ridden part of the woodlot. It's humid as heck. We're sweating bullets here, and we got a wee bit of a taste of what it would have been like to have been a surveyor in the 1750s. A couple of questions, though. If you came to an obstacle, let's say a huge boulder, and it's on your sight line, or a really large tree, are Bob and I going to have to cut that tree down with this little axe?
Not necessarily. You could do a couple of things. You could take a different, you could use that as a corner and go a different way, or you can go around it. Use the chain. The chain is 66 feet, so you can measure around that tree, and there are markings on the chain that allow you to say it's 40 feet around or whatever. And then you could take the halfway point and go again, and use that in your notes as a marker of some kind, large tree, big boulder, pile of rocks.
Just a landmark.
A landmark, and it helps you find the land when you're searching for it.
And you'd take the same degree line you had on this side of the obstacle, set it up on the point on the other side.
Yeah, and it
190 degrees,
yeah.
for example.
And it doesn't change. So if you stop here, you figured out what the halfway point is, you go over there, it's 190 degrees, and off you go.
There we go. And we covered river crossings. I think we covered it all.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Bob, but would you want this job in 1750?
I think the sounds of Simon Kenton's tomahawk claims sounds a lot easier.
A whole lot easier. You know, if I were doing it, I want his job, not ours, with the axis. What do you think?
Yes.
Anyway, Jason, it's been a pleasure. You've certainly educated us, and I know Bob and I have, well, as I mentioned, it's a passion to learn stuff, and it's been a learning experience, sir.
It's been fun seeing Kelly Station.
There you go. You're welcome back anytime.